news was big in your family. I love reading, your father would be reading a newspaper article and then say, cancel this paper and get a new one.
Right.
And soon you were getting papers from so far away, they were a few days old.
That's true.
That early love of the news in your family seemed to be a big part of shaping you.
Well, no question about it. That I've been very lucky. I've known since childhood what I wanted to do, which was be a reporter. Television was not on my horizon, but I wanted to be a reporter. And I'm not quite sure why that came to be true, but what I concluded was both my father and mother, who came up into adulthood during the Depression, neither one finished high school. My mother later got a high school equivalency. But they were smart and they had a lust for information. So we took newspapers, and we had newspapers all over the house. My mother and father were voracious newspaper readers, and I think what happened is by seeing them so absorbed by newspapers, I came to believe, well, it must be important if my parents are spending this much time in the papers. So I think from that tiny seed grew, newspapers are important. I'd like to do something bigger than myself. I'd like to do something part of bigger than myself. And from that tiny seed, my desire and my drive to become a reporter grew.
And your love, many people may not know that you actually started a newspaper. Who has a subscription to this paper? It was actually very early on that you started it at elementary school.
Yes.
So,
well, my mother and father both recognized that I wanted to be a reporter. My father was very skeptical about it in the sense that he wasn't sure anybody could make a living being a reporter. But my mother, and God rest both their souls, I had good parents. I've been mightily blessed by having very good parents. And so she talked to our elementary school principal, Miss Simmons, who was an important part of forming my character such as it is, said to Miss Simmons, Dan's interested in newspapering, can we do a little newspaper? So we put out a little elementary school newspaper, just one, sometimes 1.5 pages. And then I threw newspapers. This tells you how long ago it's been. I had several paper groups beginning when I was between 7 and 8 years old.
well, also early on, in addition to starting a newspaper, you ended up with rheumatic fever twice, which took an outdoor kid who loved to be outside, and you were bedridden for a long time. And it actually seems like that you turned that into a benefit because of the radio. Was that your first exposure to the...
That's true, except I would argue it turned me. I didn't turn it. Rheumatic fever when I was a child was every parent's dread, second only to polio. There was no known cure for it. There's a cure for it now. And so the doctor told my mother he has to go to bed and move as little as possible because rheumatic fever can affect his heart. So I was bedridden for 2 long periods, basically through junior high school, through middle school. I was bedridden. Sometimes my lessons were sent home and I studied at home. But the radio became my constant companion. I grew up in the Houston Heights, which was at the time in Houston, Texas, a tough neighborhood, what would now be called by sociologists transition neighborhood, if you will. But the radio became my constant companion. And this corresponded with the start of World War II. So some of the greatest names in electronic journalism history, Edward R. Murrow, Charles Collingwood, Eric Sevareid, became my constant companions. They took me to faraway places with strange sounding names where civilization itself hung in the balance. And I listened day and night. I didn't listen only to newscasts, but it became my constant companion. Now, I did feel, of course, alone, and I was scared, given my age, being bedridden. And for a while after that, I thought it was a big minus because I was behind. I was behind in school. I was behind in my dream of playing football and taking part in sports. And so I sort of cursed rheumatic fever. But I came to know that in some ways, it was the making of me, for better or for worse, because I did come out of it with my drive to be a reporter intact. And I learned that persistence is the single most important ingredient. I never was going to be the smartest guy around. I never was going to be the quickest thought around, but I could be as hard a working as anybody and just never give up, never, ever give up. And that persistence, which I am convinced grew out of my time with rheumatic fever, was absolutely key.
Well, in addition to persistence, you also have gratitude. You thank a lot of people. I love when I read about successful people who thank people along the way for what they gave. And one of the people, you didn't even know her name, you were 7 or 8, and you just called her the lady in the park because she kind of inspired you, took you to the library.
Yeah.
helped you begin a lifelong love affair with books and reading, which is obviously important here at BEA.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because it's impossible to overestimate what effect that had on me, both as a person and as a professional. That we had a city park, and when I was very young, the person I called the lady in the park, I didn't know it at the time. It turned out she was a social worker sent by the city government to read to children in the park. And so she would get a few kids around her and read. And I was absolutely fascinated. I remember she read Paul Bunyan. And what a world that opened up to me. So seeing my interest, she then introduced me to the local library, the Heights Library, which still exists. Beautiful little architectural gem in the middle of a bad neighborhood. And I remember going into the library for the first time and she explaining to me as best she could how the card index worked and hear the books about Paul Bunyan, hear the books about Cowboy Copas and other people. And it just opened up a tremendous new vista to me. And then when she took me to the downtown city library, the big library downtown in Houston, huge by the standards of that day, it reinforced a love of reading for me. And naturally, as I got to be a reporter, reading and research is important, but I've always been indebted to her. I wish I had known her name.
Well, life is full of these small moments, and it strikes me throughout this book, in your early childhood, if you hadn't gone to meet this lady in the park, if you hadn't had rheumatic fever to kind of listen to the radio and kind of get that in you early, if you hadn't had Professor Cunningham talk you out of football and kind of push you into journalism,
True.
right?
True.
Your life would be very different without these very small moments.
Well, it'd be a whole lot different. I probably would have gone to the oil fields for good when I was 14 or 15 years old, which in our time and place was the common thing to do. I probably would not have become a reporter. But you know, life is that way. The mystery of how life develops always brings a smile to my face. And those rheumatic fever doesn't bring a smile to my face, but even the worst time for me, and having rheumatic fever was probably the worst time in childhood, unquestionably was the worst time, it turned out to be a plus.
Well, I'm going to flash forward. You ended up in radio, joined KSAM, and you developed this amazing ability to ad-lib, whether it was sports events or whatever was going on of the day, you were ad-libbing, and so it also seemed to shape you. But then at another radio station, you met Gene,
right,
who changed your life, and you've been married now how long?
55 years.
55 years.
Thank you.
That's an applause line today. So 55 years, and have had a terrific life together through everything that you've done. But your first TV job is kind of unbelievable, reading about it. I mean, you were doing everything.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, today's mass comm students that are studying broadcast, they don't have to splice the tape and figure out this and have one thing go. You had one button if it was a commercial, another button voiceover.
It's true.
Are they benefiting today from the technology, or was there something early on that you think you had because you had to do all of that?
Well, I've always felt, again, very lucky and blessed because I learned the business from the bottom up. Little KSAM, the radio station in Huntsville, and the Huntsville Item, which was a weekly newspaper. That was part of my apprenticeship. It's about the lowest stage of journalism. But the point is, learning, starting at the bottom and learning as you go up, you know how things are done. You mentioned ad-libbing. I had no way of knowing it at the time that I did play-by-play football, basketball, baseball, boxing, track, did it all, where there's no script. And I'm sure I was terrible when I started, probably terrible when I ended, but I did learn to hold microphone, later to be known as hold screen, on something like election nights or the explosion of the space shuttle, or God forbid 9/11, anything where you have to be on camera for a long time, talking, leading coverage, nonstop, basically without a script. I got that training in a small radio station, then in a larger radio station, and it stood me in good stead. I would say when the time came to choose a successor to Walter Cronkite, no one replaces a legend, a rightfully iconic legend, such as Walter Cronkite. I succeeded Walter Cronkite, but I know that when the decision came, they were choosing who was to do that. One of the criteria was, well, who can ad-lib? When there's no script and something explodes, earthquake, something, who can take microphone and camera and keep it going? And my early experience, which had made me a strong ad-libber, was one of the reasons that I got the job.
And also you ad-libbed. Many people may not realize that Dan Rather actually invented modern day hurricane coverage. So as you're watching the weather, you invented it. And in some ways, I think you've been running toward hurricanes, not just the kind in weather, your whole life.
Well, you know, I grew up in hurricane country on the Texas coast. And my late grandmother, Paige, was filled with the mystery, the lore, and legend of hurricanes past. And I knew a lot about hurricanes. And when I worked at the radio and in television stations in Houston, because I had grown up with it as a child and experienced hurricanes, that I remember my grandmother, Paige, once said, Danny, she called me, the closest you're going to get to God is probably in the eye of a hurricane. So hurricane coverage became kind of a signature. As you say, when I was working at KHOU in Houston, nobody had done live hurricane coverage up to that time. Radar was still pretty new. I know how long ago this must seem to you, but radar was new. And we had the idea of putting the radar picture of this huge hurricane, Hurricane Carla, on the screen. And then I had the idea of, well, let's superimpose a scale map of the Texas coast over this huge hurricane, which will show people how big it is and encourage people to evacuate. We sort of stumbled into it, but yes, I mean this in no self-serving way. In so doing, we kind of invented modern hurricane coverage.
I want to take you to February 1962, your first day walking into CBS News, where you would end up staying for many, many years. And you meet one of your boyhood idols from the radio days that you were listening, Charles Collingwood. You're completely tongue-tied. So what's it like to meet somebody that you watched giving the news your whole childhood?
Well,
not that I would know.
Well, you know, I'm happy and very grateful that I walked the halls with legends of CBS News. When I walked in, I could not believe it. You know, there's Charles Collingwood's office. Eric Sevareid writes over here. Walter Cronkite is over here. You know, to tell you the truth, I had some of the arrogance of youth. By the time I got to CBS News, I'd been a reporter for more than 12 years as a professional reporter. I thought I was pretty good. I knew how to report, I knew how to write. But as soon as, the first day there, I realized I'm going to have to raise my game and raise it a lot in order to stay here. And Charles Collingwood, whom you mentioned, he's now deceased, was so kind to me. This was one of the best known names in the history of electronic journalism. And he could see that I was raw, that I wasn't nearly as good as I'd like to think I was. And for example, he looked over my suit of clothes, which is the most expensive suit of clothes I had ever owned, because I wanted to walk in the first day in a good suit. And he said to me very kindly, no, my boy, that will not do. We'll have to get you a better suit, which he arranged to do. But one of the threads running through the book is that old phrase, the kindness of strangers. I have been helped so many times along the way, in so many ways, not just by teachers, not just by parents or friends of mine, but people who had nothing to gain by helping me at all. And at each step of the way, somebody appeared seemingly out of nowhere to give me a hand up. And now that I'm older and my steps are growing slower, I try to do that with as many young people as I can, because it meant so much to me.
Well, you're 80 years old now. You've had this storied career in journalism. You've been at all of the big events. I just want to walk through very quickly and just rapidly kind of get your impression. Your coverage at CBS early on, we were just talking backstage of the civil rights movement. So much so that CBS started to be referred to as the colored broadcasting system. And,
yes.
And you found yourself in some dangerous situations, probably. Was that the first?
Well, we did find ourselves in dangerous situations. You know, I find as a nation, as a people, as a society, we have a certain amount of amnesia about what the reality of the civil rights situation was, particularly for people of color. Yes, reporters such as myself were in danger, but nothing like the danger of people of African heritage in the South. I saw things, covering Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement changed me as a person, as a pro, because I could not believe. I grew up in a segregated society. Texas was segregated. But I had never seen a Ku Klux Klan rally. I had heard about them. But to be at a Ku Klux Klan rally and feel that tingle up your spine of fear, and all I could think about, if I'm this afraid, if this has this effect on me, what must it be like to be of color and to know this is happening down the street and these people are talking this way. To see people in power in city government turn high-pressure fire hoses loose on children and on adults. I can't tell you, and I apologize for the notion of this, but I can't tell you what effect. I would not have believed that people would do this. They turn fire hoses, vicious dogs, on women and children. Now, you go through that, and while you're in danger some of the time, yes, and again, I don't want to over-dramatize it, I did have a sense of mission about it, that people need to know. People need to know what's happening, what's really happening. And I would say, even at this late date, having mentioned amnesia, it's very easy to forget how really dangerous it was for people of color, particularly those who spoke out. Now, because we were of CBS News, and because we were leading in this particular coverage at that particular time, we were called the colored broadcasting system, the communist broadcasting system. Many local stations in the South, most of them would not feed our material to the network. That was the reality. But I mentioned this national amnesia, which I would urge people in the audience to think about. The reality of the Vietnam War, that Vietnam was a green jungle hell for the people who had to fight the war on all sides. There were unspeakable horrors in the war. And the most powerful people in the country, both Republican and Democrat, both so-called conservatives and so-called liberals, were trying to convince people in this country that everything was fine, the war was going just fine. If you're a reporter and you have to be there to get the pictures, you see such a different picture. And I do think people tend to forget with Watergate, what we call Watergate for short, just one word. Watergate was a widespread criminal conspiracy led out of the Oval Office by a president of the United States. There's never been any joy in saying that, almost unbelievable. But people tend to forget and say, well, Watergate, yes, President Nixon got in some kind of trouble, I don't know what it is. Understand, more than 40 people out of that administration were sentenced to hard time as a result. And the president resigned as a, quote, unindicted co-conspirator in this widespread criminal conspiracy.
Throughout all that period, as you walk through it, and we were talking about it, and your book lays it out so clearly, when you read the way you describe Dr. Martin Luther King, in the midst of all of that he was facing, you call him peace at the center.
I think if anyone in the audience had been with me in the times when I was around Dr. Martin Luther King in close one-on-one, which sometimes wasn't all that often because we weren't allowed to, the powerful forces would keep you away. But I think that would have been your impression. It was chaotic. Not only was it dangerous, and Dr. King knew how dangerous it was. He knew very early on that he was not likely to live at a late date. But he had this, what I did describe and do describe as this peace at the center, that Andrew Young and other people around him could be hustling about, and they'd be arguing with one another what to do, whether to go to Birmingham or to go to Jackson. But Dr. King had this sort of inner peace about him. While everything around him was chaotic, yes, so much was dangerous. Listen, he wasn't an angel, he wasn't a perfect person, but he had this ability to sort of distill within himself a quietness, a steadiness, which I describe as peace at the center.
Well, the book also takes you through all the presidents that you've known. And right. So it's a view through modern history through the lens of Dan Rather that is fascinating. And it's impossible to recreate that moment in the book, right. But I just want to ask you for quick impressions about each one of these presidents as we just go through. So I've heard that you really admired Dwight Eisenhower.
I do. I've covered every president, interviewed every president since Harry Truman, beginning with Dwight Eisenhower. Let's go down the list very quickly. Dwight Eisenhower, tremendous war hero, had great command presence. He was a big delegator of authority, saving himself for the big decisions. I think his presidency, two-term presidency in which the nation was basically at peace, is underestimated. President John Kennedy, the first television president. Yes, television existed, but President Kennedy was the first president who realized the power of television to help persuade the nation.
And you were there on November 22nd, 1963.
I was.
In Dallas.
Which is a reminder that President Kennedy's presidency only lasted 1,000 days, cut short in Dallas when he was assassinated, and then incredibly, the assassin was assassinated. I know being there, I couldn't believe it. I mean, We'd gone through Friday when the president was assassinated, and we got to Sunday. My God, the assassin has been assassinated. What's going on here? But with President Kennedy, he had tremendous potential to be one of the great presidents because his administration only lasted 1,000 days, we were never able to see what that potential would eventually be. President Lyndon Johnson, you can like him or not like him, one of the great presidents of the 20th century, or for that matter, one of the great presidents that we've had in terms of domestic policy. Look what he did. At his own expense and expense of his party, passed the voting rights bill. Before that, I was in Mississippi when African-American people would turn up at the polls with the late Medgar Evers, whom I knew, who was assassinated. They would say, we're registered, we paid our poll tax, and the guy at the voting booth would say, I don't give a damn what you've got, you ain't voting here today. That was the reality. Lyndon Johnson, with the help of Congress, turned that around. Open housing laws. You go right down the list. In terms of domestic policy, President Johnson stands with the greats. Of course, the negative side was Vietnam. He inherited Vietnam from President Kennedy, but he expanded the war greatly, and he refused to acknowledge the reality that the very best we could do was a standoff. President Nixon, we talked about before, he came to the presidency perhaps as well qualified as any person we've had in the presidency, with the possible exception of the early stages of the republic. He'd been a congressman, a senator, two-term vice president. He had potential to be a great president, but he was such a hater. For what reason, I do not know. It wasn't good enough to beat your opponent at the polls. He wanted to destroy his opponents. And where that came from within him, his childhood, psychologically, I don't know. But the Nixon presidency, in many ways, it was an outrage because of the criminality, but it was also a tragedy because he never lived up to his potential. President Ford, who inherited the presidency, was never elected, had a short presidency. He was among the more likable presidents that I have been around, just on a man-to-man, person-to-person basis, very low-key and likable person. However, he pardoned President Nixon. I've always believed, and I wrote in the book, that I think there was a deal made, inherent or otherwise, that if the worst came for President Nixon, that President Ford would pardon him. But nonetheless, President Ford was president for such a short time. We came to Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter, on my list, is one of the 2 or 3 smartest presidents that I've been around. That is, if you gave him an IQ test or the SAT test, Jimmy Carter, remember, he's a graduate of Annapolis, became a nuclear engineer, but he was too detail-oriented.
And you have a very famous interview where you're interviewing him and you had him grade himself.
Yes.
And then at the end, you tallied it up.
Well, I did do this interview, which when people say, you know, Dan Rather, he's tough on Republican presidents, but Democratic presidents, I had trouble with President Lyndon Johnson. I had trouble with President Carter. I had my difficulties with President Clinton. But President Carter, he was honest. And I asked him to grade himself, you know, what about domestic policy? What about foreign policy? What about environment? And he was honest. He gave himself some B's, B minuses. So at the end, when I said, you know, Mr. President, you have a C+ average, he was really shocked.
Ouch.
President Reagan, one of the great underestimated powers of the American presidency is the power to persuade. And on that scale, not to say there aren't other scales, at least on that scale, he was great. His title, the Great Communicator, was well earned. Not just because he'd been an actor, he'd been very active in politics. That he knew that the power of the presidency was in no small part the power to persuade. And he was a 2-term president. The Iran-Contra scandal, and it was a scandal, constitutional crisis late in his presidency, heard some. We come to President George H.W. Bush, a bona fide World War II hero, no question about it. He was a 1-term president, I think partly because, and I write this in rather outspoken, the George H.W. Bush presidency should be seen as the 3rd Reagan term. If President Reagan could have run and had chosen to run, no question he would be reelected. And so the first Bush presidency we see as extension of the Reagan term. There was a recession at the end of it, which helped defeat him. Get to Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, whether you like him or not like him, again, one of the smartest presidents. Again, on SAT test or IQ test, smart. And what's called retail politics, meeting people, Bill Clinton has that ability. If you shake hands with him, if you only have him in front of your face for 5 seconds, he's in the moment. He's there, and you have no doubt about it, which is one reason he became a 2-term president. Tremendous person-to-person retail politics president. We come to the presidency of George W. Bush, which the coverage of what he did and did not do when he was avoiding having to go to Vietnam is a part of the book, not the main part of the book. He did some good things, unquestionably. A 2-term president, again, did some good things. I do think, it's my opinion, only my opinion, I think history will record that the decision to, in effect, move away from Afghanistan and go into Iraq was a strategic blunder of historic proportions. And I think history will record it that way. And then we come to the presidency of Barack Obama. Barack Obama is one of those people, look, intellectually and emotionally, everything you see and hear about him, he has the qualities you hope to find in a president. To my great surprise, that his first term has been mixed at best. You compare his campaign with his presidency, and it's almost as if 2 different people are operating. But we're not at the end of the Obama presidency yet, not at least yet. In my opinion, he has a very difficult road to get reelected.
And you also said that if he does get reelected, you hope that he lets the fresh new talent.
Well, that would be the hope,
century.
that if he gets reelected, he doesn't need my advice. But I think one of the mistakes that he has made, that he pretty much called on the same old people for financial and economic advice. Same people who were around during the Bush administration, same people around during the Clinton administration. Rather than going to the fresh thinking innovators and entrepreneurs of the country and meeting with them and getting their input, I think he's made a mistake in not doing that. If he is elected to a 2nd term, then the hope would be that he'd have fresh lists of talent coming in and be more open to what I call the new economy of the country. But I do want to say it's by no means certain whether you're a Republican or Democrat, conservative or liberal, whatever you think about the campaign. We're still early in the campaign, but in my book, I'm in a minority among reporters I know, that right now President Obama is a slight underdog. And the reason is the economy. Most people, in the end, vote their pocketbooks. And I think he'll have to be hurry and a little bit lucky to beat back Mitt Romney. And Mitt Romney is a very strong candidate. I know a lot of people who like President Obama or Democrats don't want to believe it, but Mitt Romney can be a very strong candidate. His greatest problem is the perception, it may not be the reality, the perception that he lacks authenticity, that he's inauthentic, that he doesn't know where he stands, he's all over the place. But there's a way to go, and we'll see what happens in November.
And if you meet him in person, as I have, it's a different impression. You feel very authentic. Well, I'm wondering, you spent a lot of time in the book about CBS News and the end of CBS News when you left. Right. And there are those who would say he was honorably discharged, the commission did this, yes. This has been looked at, it's over, it's just, it's ancient history. And you would say, I've heard you, it's the truth, this is this and that and the other. The question I have is, why, you have this storied career that's unbelievable, and what people want to know is, we forget about all of that. We just know Dan Rather as this icon in the news industry. Why is that so difficult? And you start out the whole book about it, and then you come back to it.
Well, to tell you the truth, I didn't want to write about it. That story happened 8 years ago. I left CBS News 6 years ago. It's a long time ago, I agree. It's history, if not ancient history. But I wanted to write this book. I wanted to put between hardcovers the kind of stories I tell my family and friends when we're at ease, and they ask me, what was it really like in Vietnam? I wanted to do that, but I realized that if I didn't write about my difficult time at CBS and the Bush story, people would dismiss the book saying, well, he ducked and dodged. He didn't deal with things. So I'm at peace about it. I've moved on. I have a great passion for what I'm doing now. But for anybody who's interested, less than a fourth of the book, a little less than a fourth of the book is on this. The only 2 things I say, if anybody's interested, number 1, we reported the truth. It's not a matter of opinion. It's not a matter of, well, maybe this and maybe that. Fact. that he got in, a young George Bush got into the so-called Champagne Unit, a special privileged unit of the National Guard, through his father's influence in order to ensure that he wouldn't go to Vietnam. It's a tough truth, but it's the truth. There's no question that's true. He's never denied it. Number two, once he got in the service, he did reasonably well for a little while. Then he just walked away. He disappeared for a year. Nobody in the military, nobody can disappear overnight, much less for a year. Now, he wasn't held accountable for that because he was the son of privilege. There's no joy in saying that. Those two things are true. You can argue till the cows come home about the process by which we got to the truth, and nobody on American television has reported that story. So for anybody who's interested, yes, part of the book deals with that.
It does take you through that. Well, Dan Rather has certainly been known for Hurricane Dan and running into every hurricane that you can find around the news. He's still doing that with Mark Cuban on HDNet. The book is a fascinating, really walk through your life, through history. It's great. Dan will be signing at the Hachette booth at 11, and we also will be posting an interview with him on my blog at skipprichard.com later. But thank you so much.
Thank you
been
so much.
fascinating.
Thank you
really,
very,
really
very much.
appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.